Handguns have been with us for several centuries now, and throughout that time, they've been a stalwart friend to mankind, glued reliably to our hips whenever we happen to find ourselves with, well, the need for something small and handy. Just in case, be we soldier, police officer, hunter, or just a civilian. But because of this niche that they fill oh so well, most handguns tend to be a bit, well, small. And we have a word to describe handguns like that. Boring. Instead, what we're interested in today are the ones that are the polar opposite of that. The big ones, the brash ones, and dare we say it, the ridiculous ones. The handguns that are either so physically large or go downrange with so much power that the only word to describe them is OP. And we shall be taking a look at 5 of them, so let's go. Oh, and if you just happen to be gritting your teeth in anticipation of yet another video about powerful handguns on this illustrious platform of YouTube that mentions nothing but Desert Eagles and 44 revolvers, it's not happening today. We've intentionally tried to think outside of the box to keep things fresh for you. You're welcome. Dear audience, may we begin our first chapter by introducing you to this bad boy, the mighty 4-bore, an olden days black powder era cartridge that was used for killing very big things very quickly. Imagine being a mutton-chopped Victorian chap on safari when suddenly a giant elephant decides to charge at you. A 4-bore rifle was what you could reach for to drop it in one shot. Given time, the cartridge would also find its way into pistols for much the same reasons. As you can see on the screen right now, 4-bore is just a bit big. And if you happen to be wondering about specifics, a 4-bore projectile would typically have a diameter of exactly 1 whole inch and also weigh 1/4 pound. Being a black powder round, it was a tad slow with a typical muzzle velocity in the range of 1200 to 1400 feet per second as compared to the 3,000 or so feet per second that you'd get out of a modern smokeless powder rifle round. This, incidentally, was exactly why it was so big. Black powder has a rather slow maximum potential muzzle velocity, so when you need to make it pack more punch, well, what do? You make the projectile bigger. Simple. Oh, and if you happen to be wondering what the hell an X-bore even is, don't worry, it's rather out-of-date bullet lingo at this point, but it simply is an old British system of measuring the barrel diameter according to the number of round lead balls of that size that would make up 1 pound of lead. So a perfectly circular lead ball of 4-bore size would equate to around 1/4 pound of lead, just as we mentioned. What a sensible system of measurement. But as ridiculous as 4-bore pistols were, they at least had some practical use to them, even if it was rather niche. The same can't be said for its bigger brother, the frankly ridiculous 2-bore. As you might have already guessed, it's twice as heavy as the 4-bore, with a typical spherical projectile weighing an entire ½ pound. As for its physical size, a normal 2-bore round is 1.3 inches in diameter. Muzzle velocity is in the same ballpark of 4-bore, but typically strays a tad higher, in the region of 1500 feet per second or so. As a result of all this, a 2-bore cartridge ends up with a typical muzzle energy in the region of 17,500 foot-pounds. And to put this in perspective, because it probably doesn't mean that much to you, a 50 caliber BMG, the round most people are referring to when they say 50 cal, typically produces muzzle energy in the region of 12 or 15,000 foot-pounds, less than a 2-bore. Further to that, a 50 BMG projectile also typically weighs somewhere around 0.1 pounds, so a 2-bore is give or take 5 times heavier than a 50 cal. Naturally, however, thanks to smokeless powder, the 50 BMG is rather faster, having a typical velocity in the 2,800 to 3,000 feet per second kind of area. And in case that wasn't mad enough, don't forget this is a video about pistols, whereas the 50 BMG is a rifle round. So yes, this ridiculous round, which is actually broader than the modern cannon diameter benchmark of 20mm, has actually been put into pistols. Unlike the 4-bore, however, which did have a legitimate use back in the black powder days, there is no such legitimate usage for 2-bore that we were able to find in our research. Instead, it appears as though it was, and still is, little bit a windmilling tool for aspiring gunsmiths. An easy way of getting attention by saying, look at this ridiculous thing I made, aren't I such a clever big boy, please buy my guns. We also know basically nothing about the history of the 2-bore, as seemingly no historian has ever taken the time to delve into the matter. They just kind of turn up every now and again, with a great example being Stolzer & Sons' Lil Deuce 2-bore black action percussion pistol, which was made from 2011 to 2012 by Stolzer & Sons, a small craft gunsmith that specializes in making big bore firearms. Dirty Harry once famously claimed that a .44 Magnum revolver was the most powerful handgun in the world. Certainly, this made for quite the exhilarating cinematic experience when the luck of the punk to whom he proclaimed it was put to the test, but alas, though exciting, the claim was in fact a big old load of bollocks, as at that time, the mighty .454 Castle existed, and it had done since 1958, and it packed a whopping typical muzzle velocity of 1900 foot-pounds as compared to the 1000 to 1400-ish typical muzzle velocity of the .44 Magnum, or .44 Remington Magnum to give it its proper name. But even the .454 Castle is a bit of a pea shooter compared to the 600 Nitro Express, which has been knocking around since all the way back in 1899 and posts a typical muzzle velocity in the region of 7,000 to 8,000 foot-pounds. But as the gun nuts and mutts you have no doubt already shouted at your screens by now, this is to be expected, right? As 600 Nitro Express is a rifle round and so is far bigger than any handguns around, and thus, of course it is more powerful, so why do we bring it up on this video about OP handguns, Simon? Get to it! Well, that would be because in 2001, an Austrian craft gun manufacturer by the name of Pfeiffer-Waffen put it into a revolver, and here it is. Behold. Dubbed the Pfeiffer Zaliska 600 Nitro Express revolver, it came about because somewhere in the rolling peaks of the Austrian Alps, a shooting enthusiast by the name of Adolf Zaliska, who had far too much disposable income and an enormous love of the golden age of big game hunting that was the late Victorian period, wanted his favorite cartridge, the 600 Nitro Express, crammed into a handy-dandy revolver package, because apparently why not? And a few months later, after many Austrian shilling had changed hands, this ridiculous revolver was born, with it essentially just being an enlarged version of Pfeiffer-Waffen's earlier, already very large .458 Win Mag revolver. It weighs about 13 pounds, which is safe to say quite heavy for a handgun, given that a typical Glock 17, as very likely carried by your local police officer, weighs around roughly 1.5 pounds. Partly, this weight was the result of mere fate. A revolver firing a big round is naturally going to be quite big, but also this weight was very intentional, as a heavier gun has less recoil than a lighter gun, thanks to its mass absorbing some of the energy. And so, quite intentionally, no effort towards weight saving was made during its design process, so that, touch wood, you wouldn't need to book a rhinoplasty appointment after every range day. Despite purportedly costing him the equivalent of $17,000 and $40 per round, although the sources don't specify whether or not these figures are adjusted for inflation or not, Zaliska couldn't have been more chuffed with his new toy and started showing it off to anyone who would take an interest, firearms magazines included. Naturally, quite a few others then started taking an interest in the ridiculous revolver which fired a round that could stop an elephant in its tracks, and, well, they wanted one for themselves, because of course they did, and that led Pfeiffer to continuing to pump out a few more in the following years. It appears as though it was discontinued at some point, however, because as of the time of writing, there is no reference at all in Pfeiffer's sales catalogue. All in all, it's ridiculous, it's impractical, it's ungodly expensive, and it's almost impossible to find one for sale today, but be honest, you kinda want one, don't you? Now bear with us, folks, because no doubt, having just heard this chapter's title, many of you are now ready to launch your device out of the window while screaming words to the extent of Sideprojects, you tools! Everyone knows the Gyro Jet was a load of crap, and so should you. Shame! But, well, hold that thought, folks, because today we aren't looking for reliable, cost-effective, or even practical handguns, are we? We're looking for powerful ones! Did you not read the title? Did you not? And there is no doubt that the Gyro Jet, for all of its many flaws, definitely fits into this category. For those of you not in the know, however, allow us to give you a quick overview of the Gyro Jet. Developed in the 1960s by Robert Mainhart and Art Beale of MBA Associates, it was a pistol whose function was every bit as sci-fi as it looks, because it fired rocket ammunition. And you did mishear us there, we did say rocket ammunition, as in tiny little rockets that fly out of the barrel straight into the face of whatever villain the Gyro Jet happens to be pointed at. These rockets, or microjets as they were referred to in the official lingo, were caseless rounds that had their rocket motors built into the projectile itself. As a result of this, unlike a normal firearm whose bullets stop accelerating after they leave the barrel because there's no more explosion behind them, the microjet would carry on accelerating once it was free of this barrel, and this theoretically anyway, would result in lower recoil as acceleration was no longer happening internally of the firearm and greater accuracy, as the rocket motors would be actively twisting the round for far longer than a normal bullet would while it goes through the barrel. It also packed a fair punch too, with some estimates claiming that once a microjet had traveled 60 feet and was up to full speed, about 1200 feet per second or so, it had twice as much energy as a 45 ACP round. Unfortunately, however, the microjet was a big old load of junk in the real world. Theoretically, the idea was a good one, make no mistake, but it was an idea that required beyond precise manufacturing of the projectiles to work correctly, and that simply couldn't be figured out by MBA associates. So some microjets would work an absolute treat, but then the next one out of the barrel would be about as accurate as a Sunday League striker after 15 pints of lager. Worst of all, however, remember how we said the microjet continued accelerating out of the barrel? Well, with that in mind, how fast do you suppose a microjet traveled immediately after leaving the barrel? To use the technical term here, it was slow as in it couldn't even reliably penetrate a man's chest at point-blank range. And on top of that, the microjets were also unfathomably expensive, and if you know anything about Uncle Sam, he could be a tad allergic to revolutionary new technologies that promise the world for a price. So, naturally, after playing with it a bit here and there in Vietnam to suss it out, the US Army was not interested in adopting it at all. Incidentally, this is something that has only gotten worse with time as Gyrojets have gotten more and more interest over the years, and let's be frank, they've become a bit of a gun meme, so the value of the few that MBA made have gone through the roof and will now set you back $6,000-ish for a nice one, as well as the ammo. And if you could find someone still making the ammunition, it's going to set you back a couple of $100 a round. So, with all of that in mind, where do we find the gold, the barefaced cheek to put the Gyrojet on this list of OP handguns? Well, remember what we said about it having twice the energy of a 45 ACP round when the stars aligned? Well, yeah, it's that. When it worked right, the Gyrojet was a downright terrifying tool, and seeing as how we're specifically thinking outside the box today to keep this list different to all of those other copy and pasted lists of powerful handguns on the internet, well, let's absolve the Gyrojet of its many sins and judge it at its absolute best, shall we? Now we must travel back in time several centuries to have a look at this one, the Chong Tong pistol, which was created all the way back in Korea in 1432 during the reign of King Sejong. Now, we'll be the first to admit, this doesn't exactly look like the most terrifying tool ever placed into man's palm, so what historiography manipulation have we done to justify it as an interesting inclusion in today's video? Well, it's simple. This was the first handgun, and what could be more OP than having no competition at all? In many ways, it was a FP45 Liberator 500 years before its time, as it was designed to be a cheap and cheerful bit of kit that was lightweight and easy enough to handle so that any able-bodied person could use it. It's made primarily from bronze and measures 13.8 centimeters in length by 1.4 centimeters across, with a barrel diameter of 1.4 centimeters. As for ammo, it shot small arrows rather than any sort of metal bullet as we might imagine it today, and was operated by shoving some gunpowder down the barrel, stuffing the arrow in the front of it to both compact said gunpowder and sealing it in tight, and then lighting a fuse that poked out the back, which would burn down, ignite the gunpowder, and shoot out the arrow. A bit clunky compared to a Glock, to be sure, but for the 15th century, it was a damn clever bit of kit. Opinions on it were mixed at the time. King Sejong apparently found its range, about 200 yards or so, on a good day to be disappointing, as he apparently pictured his handguns as having the exact same range as a big boy towed cannon. It was the same technology after all, so why shouldn't it shoot as far? The soldiers on the ground, however, who were forced to take a more pragmatic view of things, what with the whole enemy trying to kill them and all that, soon grew to love it, particularly the cavalry, who would often keep a bag load of them to hand to quickly fire off simple, devastating barrages without having to reload. Further to that, it also came to be appreciated by those engaged in clandestine operations, who valued its ability to be discreetly stowed away in one's clothes. Civilians took a shine to it too. The state could pump them out by the thousands since they were so simple, and give them to basically everyone who wanted one, and because it didn't require immense upper body strength to effectively operate like a bow did, anyone could pick one up and get a few shots off if the barbarians ever poured through the gate. As for its lethality, that is something we know a lot about, as modern Korean historians have extensively put recreations of the Chong Tong through its paces to see what it was capable of, and after letting them off against ballistic dummies, it was found that it could quite happily penetrate and shatter the jaw, get through the skull and lodge itself in the oh-so-sensitive grey matter that it protects, or even, if the stars aligned correctly, pass in through the front of the skull and keep on going right out through the back. Not bad for a cheap and cheerful little thing that could be used by any old civilian, right? And so, we arrive at our final entry today, and once again, we have bent the definitions of OP a little bit to bring you something legitimately interesting rather than just the 5 millionth dissection of the Desert Eagle. As for what it is, well, it's the Arsenal Firearms AF 2011. But pray tell, Simon, what even is one of these things? Well, you know the M1911, the pistol that the US first adopted as its service pistol over 100 years ago, and since then has gone on to be adopted by over dozens of countries, made by the tens of millions, and is beloved the world over for the heavy punch of its 45 ACP, the cartridge we specifically used as a point of reference 2 chapters back to give you a soft foundation for this chapter. Well, what if that absolute unit of a handgun had 2 barrels? Well, behold! As for how this works, it really is, to simplify a bit, 2 1911s smashed together. It has 2 magazines, although Arsenal Firearms supply special combo mags that share a common base for easier insertion. It has a single large slide that covers both barrels, and it has 2 triggers, which are mechanically connected so that one trigger pull will actuate both hammers and discharge both sides, something that is absolutely necessary because even if you wanted to, for some reason, discharging one side of the pistol would not produce enough kinetic energy to cycle the heavy double slide. As for its history, it was, in a nutshell, a publicity stunt. Arsenal Firearms, an Italian company, was looking at expanding into the very lucrative American market as the 2010s loomed, and they needed something to really make themselves stand out in that unbelievably saturated arena, and at some point one of their executives spitballed the idea of making a double-barreled pistol to show off the fine manufacturing quality of which they were capable. That being a smart idea, because to make something like this which actually works is a surprisingly hard thing to do, because both halves of the gun must cycle at the exact same rate as one another, or else the fresh rounds won't be in the correct position to be picked up by the shared slide as it's pushed back into battery. And really, there isn't much more to say than that. It hit the market in 2011 and seemingly is still sold to this very day, as it's still listed on Arsenal's Italian website, but curiously not on their US one. So there is a chance it's no longer being imported, although we personally find that hard to believe given how huge of a market the US is. But whatever the current state it may or may not be in, one thing is certain. If a double 1911 doesn't count as OP, then we don't know what does. Thanks for watching.